They sat me down at the dining table, the same table where I once served warm meals and listened to laughter, and they spoke in careful voices, as if choosing the softest words would make the truth hurt less. We've decided to do something different this Christmas. That was how it began. No anger, no shouting, just calm voices that carried a sentence I never thought I would hear. I nodded slowly, my hands folded in my lap, pretending I didn't already feel the ground slipping away beneath me. Different meant without me. They did not say it right away. They looked at each other first. They cleared their throats. They avoided my eyes, and then my son said the words that still echo in my ears on quiet nights. Mom, it might be better if you don't come this year. I smiled. I smiled the way mothers do when their hearts are breaking but they don't want to make their children uncomfortable. Oh, I said softly. All right. Inside something cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet break, like an old cup finally giving in after years of tiny fractures. I did not ask why. I did not ask who decided. I did not ask if they would miss me, because when you reach a certain age, you learn that questions do not always bring comfort. Sometimes they only make the silence heavier. Christmas. The word felt strange after that. For most of my life, Christmas meant warmth. It meant family. It meant belonging. And now, it meant absence. I remember the room that day. The curtains were open. Winter light came in through the window, pale and cold. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, unaware that my place in the family had just quietly shifted. My daughter-in-law sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she did not drink. My son sat beside her, shoulders tense, eyes tired. They looked relieved when I did not argue. They looked grateful when I did not cry. They did not see the way my chest tightened as I stood up from the table. They did not hear the sound my heart made when I walked out of the room. That was the day I realized something painful. You can give your whole life to your family and still end up being gently pushed aside. This is the story of how that happened to me. My name is Aisha. I am 70 years old. For most of my life, I believed that if you loved deeply and gave freely, you would always have a place to belong. I was wrong, but it took me many years to understand that. I was born in a small town where people left their doors unlocked, and neighbors knew when you were sick before you even told them. My childhood was simple, not easy, but honest. My mother taught me how to cook before I learned how to write properly. My father taught me that silence could sometimes speak louder than words. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and growing up, I believed that was enough. I married young, not out of pressure, but out of hope. My husband, Khalid, was a quiet man, not the kind who spoke big words or made grand promises, but he showed love in small, steady ways. He worked long hours, came home tired, still smiled when he saw me. We built our life slowly, a rented house, second-hand furniture, simple meals shared on the floor. When our first child was born, I remember holding him and thinking, this is my purpose. I became a mother with my whole heart. I gave everything, my sleep, my comfort, my dreams, and I never regretted it. I believed motherhood was meant to be selfless. Years passed. We had 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son. I raised them all the same way, with patience, with discipline, with love. But my son, Hamza, stayed closest to me, maybe because he was the youngest, maybe because he needed me more. When my daughters got married and moved away, he stayed, he studied, he worked. He supported us when Khalid's health began to fail. When my husband passed away, it was Hamza who held my hand through the funeral. Don't worry, Mama, he whispered. You'll always be with me. I believed him. When Hamza married Sarah, I welcomed her like a daughter. I cooked for her. I helped her settle into the house. I stayed out of her way when she wanted space. I wanted her to feel comfortable. I wanted her to feel respected. I never imagined that one day my presence would become a problem. At first, everything was fine. We lived together peacefully. I helped with the house. I watched the children when they were born. I became a grandmother. That role filled a space in my heart I didn't know was empty. I loved those children quietly, deeply. I did not interfere. I did not control. At least, I thought I didn't. But as time passed, small things began to change. Sarah became distant, not rude, just careful. She started making decisions without telling me. She preferred doing things her own way. I respected that. I told myself, times change. Hamza grew tired. Work exhausted him. Responsibilities weighed him down. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, I began to feel like an extra piece of furniture in the house, useful sometimes, in the way sometimes, easily ignored. Still, I stayed quiet, because mothers are taught to endure. The first time I felt something was wrong, it was over something small, a decoration. I had taken out an old Christmas ornament, one I used every year since my children were young. Sarah saw it and hesitated. "We're going with a simpler theme this year," she said, politely. I smiled and put it back. It shouldn't have hurt, but it did. Another time, I mentioned inviting my sister for Christmas dinner. Sarah said gently, "We're keeping it small this year." Small, that word again. Slowly, traditions disappeared, meals changed, routines changed, my role changed. No one announced it. It just happened, and I adjusted, because that's what women like me do. When they asked me to sit down that day, I thought it was about plans, maybe travel, maybe gifts. I did not expect to be uninvited from my own family's holiday. They spoke carefully. As if trying not to break something fragile. But they did break something. They broke my assumption that I would always belong. When I went back to my room that day, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. I thought of past Christmas mornings, children running, laughter filling the house, my husband's quiet smile. I wondered when I had stopped being part of that picture. I wondered when love became optional. That night, I packed nothing. I just lay awake, listening to the house breathe around me, and I realized something painful. Being alive does not always mean being included. After that conversation at the dining table, nothing looked different. The walls were the same. The furniture was the same. The house still smelled like tea and soap and cooked food, but something had shifted. I could feel it in the way my footsteps sounded louder than before. In the way my presence felt heavier, like I was taking up space that no longer belonged to me. No one mentioned Christmas again, not directly, but it lived between us. In every quiet pause, in every unfinished sentence, in every door that closed a little more firmly than usual. I began spending more time in my room, not because anyone told me to, but because it felt easier than being somewhere I was no longer needed. The first real pain didn't come from words. It came from small moments. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen, peeling apples like I had done thousands of times before. I heard Sarah on the phone in the next room. "Yes, we're doing Christmas at home this year," she said. "Yes, just us and the kids, just us." She didn't lower her voice. She didn't stop when she saw me standing there. It was not meant to be cruel. It was just careless. When she ended the call, she smiled at me politely. "Do you need anything, Mom?" she asked. I shook my head. "No," I said softly. "I'm fine." But I wasn't. My grandchildren were the hardest part. Children don't understand tension. They don't understand exclusion. They only understand change. They noticed I wasn't around as much. "Why don't you sit with us anymore?" my granddaughter asked one evening. I smiled and said, "Grandma gets tired." That word again, tired. It had become a gentle excuse. Everyone used to move me out of the picture. I still loved them the same, but I felt them being slowly pulled away from me. Sarah created new routines, homework time, screen time, quiet time, all things that happened away from me. Not because I did anything wrong, but because structure was easier without an extra voice. Hamza changed too. He spoke to me less. When he did, it was short, careful, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. One evening, I asked him gently, "Are you okay, Beta?" He nodded. "Yes, Mom, just tired." Everyone was tired, but no one seemed tired of anything except me. I wanted to ask him why he didn't defend me, why he didn't say, "She's my mother." But I didn't, because I knew the answer. He was trying to keep peace. And peace often comes at the cost of someone else's pain. As December moved forward, the house slowly filled with signs of Christmas. Boxes came out, decorations appeared, but I was not part of it. Sarah decorated the tree with the children while I sat in my room, listening to laughter through the door. At one point, my grandson came running in. "Grandma, look." He pulled my hand toward the living room. Sarah paused when she saw us. "Oh," she said. "We're almost done." It wasn't rude, but it was clear. I let go of his hand gently. "Go on," I said. "I'll see it later." He looked confused, but he went. Later never came. I started feeling invisible, like I could disappear and the house would still function exactly the same. Meals were cooked without asking what I wanted. Plans were made without including me. Even my opinions felt outdated. One night, I suggested a dish for Christmas dinner. Sarah smiled thinly. We're trying something new this year, she said. New, different, without me. The day I truly understood my place was when I overheard another conversation. I was walking past the living room when I heard Sarah say quietly, "It will be easier this way." Hamza didn't reply. Silence followed. But silence can be loud. I went back to my room and sat down. I stared at my hands. These hands had raised children, cooked meals, held pain and joy, and now, they had nothing to do. One morning, I found an empty suitcase placed near my door. No one said anything. It wasn't for travel. It was a suggestion, a quiet one. I touched the handle and felt my throat tighten. That night, I opened my cupboard. I took out my clothes. I folded them slowly, not because I was leaving, but because I needed to feel prepared. Days passed. No one asked where I would be on Christmas. No one asked if I had plans. They assumed, and assumptions hurt more than words. I considered calling my daughter, but pride stopped me. I didn't want to sound unwanted. One evening, as I lay in bed, I realized something painful. I had become a responsibility instead of a blessing, and that realization changed the way I saw everything. I stopped offering help, stopped giving advice, stopped trying. I began withdrawing, because sometimes, the only dignity left is distance. A week before Christmas, Sarah placed a small bag on my bed. "I bought you something," she said. I thanked her. Inside was a warm scarf. It was nice, but it felt like a goodbye. The night before Christmas Eve, the house was busy. Laughter, music, movement. I stayed in my room. I prayed quietly, not for myself, but for peace, and for strength, because something told me the hardest moment was still ahead. The days before Christmas felt heavy, not busy, not joyful, heavy. The house was full of movement, but my heart felt still, like it had stopped walking forward and was only waiting for something to end. Boxes arrived at the door. Shopping bags appeared in corners. The children talked excitedly about gifts and snow. I smiled when they spoke to me, but inside, I was slowly letting go. I began waking up earlier than everyone else, not because I needed to, but because the early hours were quiet. No expectations, no reminders, no feeling of being in the way. I would sit by the window with my tea and watch the sky change colors. Those moments felt like the only place I still belonged. One afternoon, while passing the living room, I heard my name. Again, I didn't mean to listen. But when someone speaks your name, your heart always leans in. "She's very sensitive," Sarah said quietly. "We have to be careful how we say it." Hamza sighed. "I know," he said. "But it's already decided." Decided, that word pressed against my chest. "She'll understand," Sarah added. "She always does." Yes, I always did. That was the problem. I stepped away before they could see me. My hands were shaking, not with anger, with clarity. For the first time, I understood something clearly. This was not temporary. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not about Christmas. This was about space, and they wanted theirs back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house, footsteps, laughter, doors opening and closing, life moving forward. Without me, I thought of my husband, how he used to sit beside me on quiet nights and say, "No matter what happens, this house is yours." He was gone, and with him, that promise. I whispered a prayer, not for comfort, but for strength, because I knew something was coming. It was 2 days before Christmas. The house smelled of spices and baked food. I stayed in my room. Around noon, there was a knock. Soft, careful. "Mom?" Hamza's voice. I took a deep breath. "Yes, Beta." He entered alone this time. He closed the door behind him. He did not sit. That told me everything. He stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like a child who knew he was about to say something painful. "Mom," he began. "We need to talk." I nodded. "I know," I said gently. He looked surprised. "You do?" "Yes." I gestured to the chair. "Sit." He did. He rubbed his hands together. He avoided my eyes. "I want you to know," he said slowly, "that this isn't easy for us." I smiled faintly. "I know," he continued. "Christmas this year, we're doing it differently." I said nothing. "We've planned a trip," he added. "Just the kids, Sarah and me." I felt my chest tighten. "Where will I be?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, then said the sentence that changed something inside me forever. "We thought it would be best if you stayed here." Alone. Double quotes. Alone. In the house, while they celebrated somewhere else. I nodded slowly. I see. He rushed to explain. It's not personal, Mom. It is personal, I said softly. But that's all right. He looked up at me then, really looked, and his eyes filled with tears. I didn't want it to be like this. I know, I said again. Those words had become my shield. A moment later, the door opened. Sarah stepped inside. She sat beside Hamza. She placed her hand on his arm. Mom, she said gently, we hope you understand. I looked at her, not with anger, not with bitterness, just with tiredness. I do, I said. She relaxed slightly. We thought it would be easier this way, she added. Easier, for them, not for me. I asked one question, only one. Do my grandchildren know? Sarah looked at Hamza. He shook his head. No, he said. We didn't want to upset them. I nodded. Of course, children are protected from hard truths. Old women are expected to accept them, for the first time in weeks. I spoke honestly. I have spent my whole life making space for others, I said quietly. I stepped back when asked. I stayed silent when hurt. I adjusted when things changed. They listened. I never wanted to be a burden, I continued. But I also never imagined I would be left behind. Hamza's shoulders slumped. Sarah looked down. I won't argue, I said. I won't make this difficult. I stood up slowly. But I want you to understand one thing. They looked at me. This hurts, I said. Deeply. Silence filled the room. I nodded once. You may go. When they left, I sat back down. My knees felt weak. My chest ached. But something else was there too. Relief. The waiting was over. The uncertainty was gone. The truth had finally been spoken. I was not wanted for Christmas, and knowing that hurt less than guessing. Later that evening, my grandson came into my room. Grandma, he said, are you coming with us? I swallowed. No, my love. Why? I smiled gently. Sometimes grown-ups do things differently. He frowned. But Christmas is for family. I hugged him tightly. Yes, I whispered. It is. And that was when I broke. Not in front of Hamza, not in front of Sarah, but in the arms of a child who loved me without conditions. Later that evening, my grandson came into my room. Grandma, he said, are you coming with us? I swallowed. No, my love. Why? I smiled gently. Sometimes grown-ups do things differently. He frowned. But Christmas is for family. I hugged him tightly. Yes, I whispered. It is. And that was when I broke. Not in front of Hamza. Not in front of Sarah. But in the arms of a child who loved me without conditions. Something inside me shifted that night. I stopped seeing myself as unwanted, and started seeing myself as someone who deserved better, even if better meant being alone. The night before Christmas, the house was quiet. Too quiet. No laughter. No clinking of plates. No excited footsteps running to the living room. I sat by the window with a cup of tea. Steam rose slowly, curling into the dim light of the room. Outside, the world sparkled with street lights, decorations, and the soft hush of falling snow. Families celebrated everywhere but not here. Here, I sat alone. Tea first. My heart ached sharply, lonely, invisible, forgotten. But slowly, a strange calm settled over me. I realized I had spent my entire life caring for others, cooking for them, worrying for them, waiting for them to call me needed or loved, and tonight, for the first time, I wasn't responsible for anyone else's happiness. The burden was lifted. I could sit, I could breathe, I could simply be. I waited by the phone, as I always did. Minutes turned into hours, hours into an entire evening. No calls, no messages, not from Hamza. Not from Sarah, not from my grandchildren. Tea first, I felt sharp pain, a deep, stabbing loneliness. Then something unexpected happened. I laughed quietly to myself. I laughed at the absurdity, the irony, the realization that I had spent years fearing this moment, and now that it was here, I could survive it. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't invisible. I was still here. I poured myself a second cup of tea, made a small plate of cookies I had baked earlier that week. I spoke aloud to the empty room. Merry Christmas, Salma. I smiled at the sound of my own voice. And in that smile, I felt a tiny spark hope. I decided then that this Christmas wouldn't be wasted. Even if no one else remembered me, I would remember myself. Even if no one else celebrated, I would honor my own presence. I brought a blanket, a small book, and a notebook to the sofa. I sipped tea. I read. I wrote. I allowed myself small pleasures without guilt. For the first time, I understood what it meant to truly care for myself. While sitting quietly, I looked at old photographs on the wall. My husband smiling in his favorite sweater, Hamza as a baby in my arms, my grandchildren laughing during past Christmases. Memories of love flooded the room. And for a moment, I allowed myself to grieve. I cried softly. Tears that weren't loud or dramatic, just steady and real. Tears for the people who had drifted away. Tears for the years I had given. Tears for the love that remained in me, despite feeling abandoned. And then I did something brave. I whispered, "Thank you, Rahim. Thank you for everything." For the first time in months, I felt peace, even amidst the heartbreak, even amidst the silence. Christmas morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the windows. I woke early, even though no one called my name. I made a small breakfast for myself: pancakes, honey, tea. I set the table for one. The silence was still heavy, but it was no longer suffocating. I realized that waiting for others to validate my love had been my habit. Now, I could honor myself without anyone else's approval. I stepped onto the balcony, feeling the cold air against my cheeks. I watched children play in the streets. Families laughed. Dogs barked. And I smiled, because though I had been left behind, I was still here, still breathing, still living, and that mattered. Christmas morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the windows. I woke early, even though no one called my name. I made a small breakfast for myself: pancakes, honey, tea. I set the table for one. The silence was still heavy, but it was no longer suffocating. I realized that waiting for others to validate my love had been my habit. Now, I could honor myself without anyone else's approval. I stepped onto the balcony, feeling the cold air against my cheeks. I watched children play in the streets. Families laughed. Dogs barked. And I smiled, because though I had been left behind, I was still here, still breathing, still living, and that mattered. As the day passed, I realized something profound. Being left behind did not make me small. Being forgotten did not erase my life. Being ignored did not diminish my worth. Life had taught me a painful lesson, yes, but it had also given me clarity. I had spent decades caring for others, and now, for the first time, I was allowed to care for myself. I cleaned the living room. I rearranged the decorations. I made my space feel warm, bright, and comforting, not for anyone else, but for me. When night fell, I lit a small candle. I watched its flame dance. It reminded me of my own resilience. How even in the darkest corners, light can exist. How, even when others turn away, we can find warmth within ourselves. I whispered a quiet prayer. May my children and grandchildren learn kindness. May they grow to understand love. May I remain strong, no matter what. I hugged the blanket around my shoulders. I closed my eyes, and I let the quiet comfort me. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. This Christmas had been different, painful, lonely, heartbreaking, but it had also been liberating. I learned that love is not measured by presence alone. I learned that self-respect is as important as devotion. I learned that even when left behind, we can find ways to survive, thrive, and cherish life. And I promise myself one thing: no matter what happens, I will never let anyone take my peace again. I would wait by the phone if I wished. I would hope for calls if I chose. But I would not depend on them to define my happiness. I had survived their absence, and I would survive anything else that came my way. The days after Christmas were calm. No calls, no messages, no knocks at the door. At first, it stung. A sharp reminder of how deeply I had been left behind. But slowly, a new rhythm settled into my life. I woke with the sun, made my tea, tended to small chores around the house. I read my books. I wrote in my notebook. I allowed myself to notice the little details: the sunlight filtering through curtains, the gentle creak of the old wooden floor, the sound of birds returning to their nests after the cold winter. Life continued quiet, ordinary, but my own. Being alone gave me time to reflect. I realized that love is not only for giving, it is also for keeping yourself intact, for keeping your heart whole, even when others forget. I started walking in the small park near my home. The crisp air on my face reminded me of the days when I would take a mirror and a yawn there. I greeted strangers with gentle smiles. I spoke to neighbors I had not seen in months. I planted a few flowers outside my window, Watching them bloom day by day, each small action, each little joy, reminded me that life still had beauty. And that I too was still capable of it. One afternoon, I found the letter I had written to my children at Christmas. I had folded it neatly, put it in an envelope, and set it aside. For a moment, I considered sending it. Then I smiled quietly. Perhaps they would read it. Perhaps they wouldn't. It didn't matter. The letter had served its purpose. It had freed me from holding on to words that might never be heard. And in that release, I found peace. One afternoon, I found the letter I had written to my children at Christmas. I had folded it neatly, put it in an envelope, and set it aside. For a moment, I considered sending it. Then I smiled quietly. Perhaps they would read it. Perhaps they wouldn't. It didn't matter. The letter had served its purpose. It had freed me from holding on to words that might never be heard. And in that release, I found peace. I began looking through old photo albums more often. Raheem smiling on our wedding day. Amir running through puddles as a child. Ayan's tiny hands reaching for me. Each memory was bittersweet. A reminder of what I had given. A reminder of what had been taken. But also a reminder of the love that still existed inside me. I realized something important. Love doesn't end just because others step away. It remains in your heart, quietly, faithfully, waiting to be remembered. And that love was mine to keep. No one could take it. One afternoon, I decided to do something bold. I called a neighbor, Mrs. Asma, who lived alone as well. We chatted about the weather, our memories, small joys, and struggles. That simple conversation opened a door. Over the next weeks, I met a few other neighbors. We shared tea, stories, and laughter. I realized that family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes family is the people who choose to be there, who see you, who care, who respect your heart. I started attending a small community group at the local library. We read poetry, shared experiences, and listened to each other. For the first time in months, I felt connected, not dependent, not overlooked, but genuinely included. The phone still rarely rang. When it did, it was usually a wrong number or a bill reminder. Sometimes, I imagined what it would feel like to hear a voice I longed for, Hamza, Sarah, my grandchildren. But I no longer waited by the phone with anxiety, no longer hoped with trembling hands. I didn't depend on their presence to validate my life. My happiness was no longer contingent on anyone else. It was mine. The phone still rarely rang. When it did, it was usually a wrong number or a bill reminder. Sometimes, I imagined what it would feel like to hear a voice I longed for, Hamza, Sarah, my grandchildren. But I no longer waited by the phone with anxiety, no longer hoped with trembling hands. I didn't depend on their presence to validate my life. My happiness was no longer contingent on anyone else. It was mine. I often think about the years I spent caring for my family, the meals I cooked, the stories I told, the nights I stayed awake, comforting children, patching clothes, or listening to problems no one else noticed. I don't regret a single moment. Even if they turned away, even if I was forgotten, even if Christmas was spent alone, every act of love I gave made me who I am. And now, I give that same love to myself, with patience, with tenderness, with gratitude. I've learned that life will not always go as planned. People will disappoint, circumstances will shift, hearts will break, but resilience is born in the quiet moments of endurance. Hope is found in small joys. Strength comes from loving yourself, even when others do not. I continue my days with simple routines. I cook, I walk, I write. I nurture small connections that remind me that I am not invisible. And slowly, over time, the pain softens, the loneliness fades, the heart begins to feel whole again. Christmas came and went. No grand celebration, no family gathering, no calls from children who once promised to care for me, but I survived. I thrived in my own small way. I found peace in solitude. I discovered love within myself, and I realized being left behind doesn't mean the end. It means the start of something new, a life where my heart is safe, where my joy is mine to nurture, where my presence matters first to me, and then, if fate allows, to others. I smile quietly as I sip my tea. The house is warm. The air smells faintly of cookies. The candle flickers softly beside me, and for the first time in a long while I feel free, alive, whole.